My 3 children made a bet on who would be the first to put me in a nursing home to divide the inheritance. When they came to get me, they found only a note. I went to my $20 million mansion in Dubai. Listen to my story until the end, and comment from which city you are watching me so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I am 78 years old. Tudo começou on that fateful Sunday evening when I discovered that my 3 children had turned my golden years into nothing more than a calculated game of greed and betrayal. I had always prided myself on being a woman of substance, having built an empire from nothing after my dear husband Charles passed away 15 years ago. What my children didn't know was the true extent of my wealth, carefully hidden behind layers of offshore accounts, shell companies, and investments that would make even the most seasoned financial advisors dizzy with envy. They saw only the modest home where I chose to live, the simple clothes I wore, and the humble lifestyle I maintained as a deliberate facade. That Sunday, as I prepared our traditional family dinner in the kitchen, I heard their voices drifting from the dining room. At first, I thought they were discussing business or their own families, but as I moved closer to serve the roast chicken, their words stopped me cold. "Look, Margaret, we all know Mother's getting more forgetful by the day," came the voice of my eldest son, Robert, a 45-year-old investment banker whose moral compass had apparently been traded for dollar signs long ago. "The sooner we get her into Sunset Manor, the sooner we can liquidate her assets and divide everything equally." My middle child, Patricia, a 42-year-old divorce attorney, who had perfected the art of manipulation in both her professional and personal life, laughed coldly. "Equally? Robert, I've been managing Mother's doctor appointments for months. I deserve a larger share for all the trouble I've gone through. Besides, I already have Willowbrook Assisted Living on standby. I can have her admitted by Monday morning." The youngest, Thomas, barely 40, but already showing signs of the gambling addiction that had cost him 2 marriages and countless jobs, slammed his fist on the table. "You two are joking, right? I've been visiting her every week, pretending to care about her boring stories and ailments. I've earned my piece of this inheritance pie. Green Valley Care Center has already approved her admission. I'm taking her there tomorrow afternoon, whether she likes it or not." "Tomorrow?" Patricia's voice rose an octave. "Thomas, you can't just make unilateral decisions about our mother's care." "Watch me," Thomas retorted. "I need the money more than either of you. My debts won't wait for your elaborate planning session." Robert's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. "Both of you are being ridiculous. I have the most experience with financial matters, and I've already spoken to Mother's doctor about her declining mental state. Dr. Harrison agrees that institutional care would be best for her safety and well-being." I felt my knees weaken as the full scope of their betrayal washed over me like a tsunami of heartbreak and rage. These were the children I had sacrificed everything for, the ones I had worked 16-hour days to put through college, the ones I had bailed out of financial troubles more times than I could count. And now they were sitting at my dining room table, eating my food and plotting to dispose of me like an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Dr. Harrison said no such thing," Patricia snapped. "I was at her last appointment, and he said she was in remarkably good health for her age." Details," Robert waved dismissively. "The point is, we need to act quickly before she does something foolish with her money. You know how elderly people can be manipulated by charities and scammers." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Manipulated? Robert, we're literally sitting here planning to manipulate our own mother into signing away her independence. The irony is killing me." "It's not manipulation," Patricia said defensively. "It's responsible adult children making difficult decisions for their aging parents' well-being. Mother would thank us later if she understood the situation properly." "If she understood?" Robert's voice dripped with condescension. "Patricia, Mother doesn't understand anything anymore. Half the time she forgets what day it is." This was completely untrue, of course. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Sharper, perhaps, honed by years of business negotiations and strategic planning. I had been playing the role of the slightly confused elderly woman because it amused me to see how people underestimated my capabilities. Little did I know that my own children would use this performance against me. "I still think we should discuss this with her," Thomas said, though his tone suggested he was merely going through the motions of appearing reasonable. "Discuss what exactly?" Patricia challenged. Hey Mom, we think you're losing your marbles, so we're shipping you off to live with strangers while we sell your house and split the proceeds. I'm sure that conversation would go over beautifully. The house alone is worth at least $800,000, Robert mused. Split 3 ways, that's roughly $267,000 each, not counting her savings account and investments. If only they knew. The house they were so eager to liquidate was the smallest asset in my portfolio. My real estate holdings alone were worth over $50 million, spread across prime locations that most people could only dream of owning. The mansion in Dubai that they would soon discover was just one of 7 properties I owned internationally, each more luxurious than the last. I need my share immediately, Thomas pressed. I owe some very serious people a lot of money, and they're not the patient type. Your gambling debts are not our problem, Patricia said coldly. Robert and I shouldn't have to sacrifice our mother's well-being just because you can't control yourself at the casino. Says the woman who's been overcharging Mother for legal services for the past 3 years, Thomas shot back. At least my vices are honest. Enough, Robert's voice cut through their bickering. We're all here for the same reason, so let's stop pretending this is about anything other than money. The question is how to proceed efficiently and with minimal drama. I had heard enough. Moving as quietly as my 78-year-old bones would allow, I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking not with age, but with a fury I hadn't felt since Charles's business partner tried to cheat me out of my rightful inheritance all those years ago. That man had learned the hard way that Eleanor Whitmore was not to be underestimated. It seemed my children were about to receive the same education. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and fake smiles. My children had perfected the art of pretending to care about my well-being while simultaneously planning my imprisonment. They asked about my health, complimented my cooking, and shared carefully edited versions of their lives, all while the weight of their betrayal hung in the air like a toxic cloud. After they left, each one hugging me goodbye with rehearsed affection, I sat in my favorite armchair and began to plan. If my children wanted to play games with my life and my legacy, I would show them what a real game looked like. The first call I made was to Marcus Rothschild, my private banker, and the only person who knew the true extent of my wealth. Marcus had been managing my offshore accounts for over a decade, and his discretion was worth its weight in gold. Eleanor, how lovely to hear from you. Marcus's cultured voice came through the phone. To what do I owe the pleasure of this late evening call? Marcus, I need you to prepare for an immediate liquidation of my local assets and a complete transfer of funds to the Dubai account, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I felt. I also need you to arrange for immediate travel and accommodation at the Dubai property. There was a brief pause. Eleanor, that's a rather drastic move. May I ask what's precipitated this decision? I gave him a condensed version of the evening's events, and his sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know about his opinion of my children's behavior. Those ungrateful little vultures, he muttered, his professional demeanor slipping momentarily. Eleanor, I've seen this scenario play out with wealthy clients before, but it never gets easier to witness. Are you certain you want to proceed this drastically? Marcus, I've spent 15 years building something magnificent while living like a pauper in this house. Also, my children could inherit something meaningful. If they want to treat me like a burden to be disposed of, then they deserve to inherit exactly what they think I'm worth. Nothing. Very well, Marcus said, his tone shifting into efficient business mode. I can have everything arranged by tomorrow evening. The Dubai mansion is fully staffed and ready for immediate occupancy. I'll also arrange for Mrs. Chen to meet you at the airport with all necessary documentation. Mrs. Chen was my personal assistant, a brilliant woman who had been helping me manage my international affairs from the shadows for years. Like Marcus, she understood the importance of discretion and the value of loyalty. The next morning, Monday, I went about my usual routine with the knowledge that it would be my last day in this house. I watered my garden, fed the stray cat that had adopted me 6 months ago, and made arrangements for Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, to care for him. Mrs. Henderson was a widow like myself, though significantly less wealthy and infinitely more genuine than my own offspring. Going on a little vacation, dear? Mrs. Henderson asked as I handed her the cat food and care instructions. Something like that, I replied with a smile. I may be gone for quite some time, so please don't hesitate to make yourself at home if you need anything from the house. I had intentionally left the house keys with Mrs. Henderson weeks ago, supposedly for emergencies, but really as part of a larger plan I had been formulating for months. If my children wanted to inherit an empty house, they were welcome to it, but they would have to deal with a very protective neighbor who had explicit written permission to treat the property as her own. That afternoon, I received 3 separate phone calls from my children, each one confirming their individual plans to collect me the following day. Robert called first, his voice dripping with false concern. "Mother, I've arranged for a very nice room at Sunset Manor. The staff there specializes in memory care, which I think would be perfect for your recent confusion." "Recent confusion?" I asked, playing my part perfectly. "I haven't been confused about anything, dear." "Of course not, Mother. That's just the sort of thing someone with memory issues would say. Don't worry, though. The professionals at Sunset Manor will take excellent care of you." Patricia called an hour later with a remarkably similar script. "Mother, I've been speaking with some medical professionals, and they agree that assisted living would be the safest option for someone in your condition." "What condition is that, Patricia?" I asked innocently. "Your declining cognitive function, Mother. We've all noticed it, and we're just worried about your safety living alone in such a big house." The house they considered big was a modest 3-bedroom colonial that could fit in the guest wing of my Dubai mansion, but I didn't bother correcting her. Thomas's call came just before dinner, and his approach was more direct than his siblings. "Mom, I'm coming to pick you up tomorrow morning. I've found a great place for you to live where you'll have people around all the time. You won't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or any of that stuff anymore." "That sounds lovely, Thomas, but I'm quite happy here." "I know you are, Mom, but it's not about what you want anymore. It's about what's best for you, and we've decided that living in a care facility is what's best." The casual dismissal of my autonomy in that statement was breathtaking in its cruelty, but it only strengthened my resolve to see my plan through to its conclusion. That evening, I packed a single suitcase with my most cherished possessions, photographs of Charles, my grandmother's jewelry, and a few books that had shaped my philosophy over the years. Everything else in the house was just props in the performance I had been giving for the past 15 years. I spent my final night in the house writing 3 letters, one for each of my children. The letters were identical in content, but personalized with specific memories and disappointments. I wanted them to understand not just what they were losing, but why they were losing it. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that had always reminded me of new beginnings. I had my coffee on the porch one last time, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It seemed fitting that my last morning in this house should be so beautiful. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus arrived in his discreet black sedan to escort me to the airport. His driver, a silent man named Giuseppe, who had worked for the Rothschild family for over 20 years, helped me with my suitcase, while Marcus handed me a manila envelope containing my new identity documents and travel arrangements. "Everything is in order," Marcus assured me. "The local accounts have been closed, and all assets have been liquidated as per your instructions. The proceeds, along with your existing international holdings, are now safely consolidated in Dubai. Mrs. Chen is already at the mansion preparing for your arrival." "And the house?" I asked. "As of this morning, the property has been transferred into an irrevocable trust with Mrs. Henderson as the primary beneficiary. Your children will discover that they have no legal claim to anything you've left behind." Mrs. Henderson had been overwhelmed when Marcus's legal team approached her with the paperwork, but she had readily agreed to serve as caretaker for the property. She was a good woman who deserved some security in her golden years, and I was happy to provide it. Before leaving, I placed the 3 letters on the dining room table, each one propped against a crystal candlestick that had belonged to my mother. The letters were positioned so that they would be the first thing my children saw when they entered the house, impossible to miss or ignore. The ride to the airport gave me time to reflect on the decision I was making. Some might call it cruel or vindictive, but I preferred to think of it as educational. My children had spent their entire adult lives taking my love and support for granted while planning to discard me at the first opportunity. Perhaps living with the consequences of their choices would teach them something about the value of family loyalty. The private jet Marcus had arranged was small but luxurious, with a crew that treated me with the respect and dignity my own children had never shown. As we taxied down the runway, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. The flight to Dubai took 14 hours, during which I dozed fitfully and thought about the new life awaiting me. The mansion there had been my secret project for the past 5 years, a palatial estate overlooking the Persian Gulf with every amenity a person could desire. It was also where I planned to establish the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting elderly individuals who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families. Mrs. Chen met me at Dubai International Airport, her efficiency and warmth a stark contrast to the cold calculation I had left behind. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, qualities that had made her invaluable in managing my international affairs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, embracing me warmly. "Everything is prepared for your arrival. The staff is eager to meet you, and I've taken the liberty of scheduling meetings with several local attorneys who specialize in international estate law." The drive to the mansion took us through the heart of Dubai, past gleaming skyscrapers and architectural marvels that would have taken my children's breath away if they had bothered to learn anything about their mother's actual life. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of modern luxury blended with traditional Middle Eastern design, sprawling across 5 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds. As we pulled through the gates, I saw the full staff assembled to greet me: gardeners, housekeepers, a chef, a driver, and a security team that would have impressed the Secret Service. These people, who were essentially strangers, were treating me with more respect and consideration than my own children had shown in years. Mrs. Whitmore, the head of household, a distinguished gentleman named Ahmed, approached with a respectful bow. "We are honored to finally welcome you to your home. If there is anything you need, anything at all, please do not hesitate to ask." That first evening in Dubai, as I stood on the master bedroom balcony overlooking the Gulf, I wondered how my children were handling the discovery of my departure. I didn't have to wonder for long. My secure satellite phone, a device none of my children knew existed, began ringing at exactly 11 o'clock local time, which would have been mid-morning back home. The caller ID showed Robert's number, and I could practically hear his panic through the display. I let it ring. The phone rang 6 more times over the next hour, with calls from all 3 of my children and even one from Dr. Harrison, who was probably wondering why his elderly patient had apparently vanished into thin air. I ignored them all. It wasn't until the following morning that I finally decided to answer, choosing Patricia's call because I knew she would be the most legally minded in her approach to the crisis. "Mother!" Patricia's voice was shrill with desperation. "Where are you? We came to pick you up yesterday morning, and you were gone. We found your letter, but this is insane. You can't just disappear like this." "I haven't disappeared, Patricia," I said calmly, settling into a comfortable chair on my terrace with a cup of genuine Turkish coffee. "I've simply relocated to more suitable accommodations." "More suitable? Mother, you're living in a fantasy if you think you can afford to stay in some luxury hotel indefinitely. We need to discuss your finances realistically." I laughed, a sound that seemed to echo across the Gulf. "My finances? Patricia, dear, I think you'll find that my financial situation is far more robust than you've ever imagined." "What are you talking about?" "Mother, we know exactly what you have. We've seen your bank statements, your investment portfolio. You have maybe $800,000 in assets, most of it tied up in the house." "Had," I corrected her. "I had those assets. As of yesterday morning, I liquidated everything and transferred the funds to my international accounts. The house has been placed in an irrevocable trust with Mrs. Henderson as the beneficiary." The silence on the other end of the phone was so complete that I wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Patricia's voice returned, smaller and more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "International accounts? Mother, what international accounts?" "The ones I've been building for the past 15 years, while you and your brothers assumed I was just a doddering old woman living on your father's life insurance policy." "This is impossible," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "How could you have international accounts? How could we not know about this?" "Because you never bothered to ask meaningful questions about my life, Patricia. You saw what you expected to see and assumed that was the complete picture." "The letter," Patricia said suddenly. "In your letter, you mentioned a mansion worth $20 million. Mother, please tell me that was just dramatic exaggeration." I looked around at my stunning surroundings, from the infinity pool that seemed to blend with the horizon to the imported Italian marble that lined the terraces. 20 million was actually a conservative estimate, Patricia. The latest appraisal put the value closer to 35 million. Another long silence, followed by what sounded like Patricia dropping the phone. When she returned, her voice was barely a whisper. How? How what, dear? How do you have $35 million? How is any of this possible? I settled back in my chair, finally ready to tell the story I had kept secret for so long. When your father died, he left me more than just a life insurance policy, Patricia. He left me the foundation of an empire. Charles had been quietly investing in international real estate and emerging markets for years, but he kept those investments separate from our domestic holdings to protect them from potential creditors or lawsuits related to his business. This was all true, though it was only part of the story. Charles had indeed left me a substantial inheritance, but I had multiplied that inheritance exponentially through careful investments and strategic partnerships that none of my children could have imagined their supposedly simple mother capable of arranging. I spent the first 5 years after his death learning everything I could about international finance, offshore banking, and real estate investment. The next 10 years were spent building something magnificent while living modestly in our old house, waiting for the right time to reveal my true circumstances. But why? Patricia's voice cracked with emotion. Why keep it secret from us? Why live like you were struggling financially? Because I wanted to see what kind of people my children had become, I said, allowing some of my disappointment to color my words. I wanted to know if you loved me for who I was, or if you would only show interest when you knew what I was worth. That's not fair, Mother. We've always loved you. Have you, Patricia? Is that why you were planning to commit me to an assisted living facility so you could liquidate my assets? Is that why you've been overcharging me for legal services while pretending it was family charity? Is that your version of love? The sound of crying came through the phone, and for a moment I felt a pang of the maternal instinct that had driven so many of my decisions over the years. But then I remembered their cold calculations, their casual dismissal of my autonomy, their eagerness to warehouse me like an inconvenient piece of furniture. We thought we were protecting you, Patricia said through her tears. Protecting me from what? From living independently in my own home? From making my own decisions about my life and my money? From being taken advantage of? From making mistakes that could cost you everything? The only people taking advantage of me, Patricia, were my own children. The only mistake that could have cost me everything was trusting you with my vulnerability. Where are you? Patricia asked again, her voice steadier now. Please, Mother, let us make this right. Let us prove that we're better than what you overheard on Sunday night. I considered this for a long moment. Part of me, the part that remembered teaching Patricia to ride a bicycle and helping her with homework and celebrating her law school graduation, wanted to believe that redemption was possible. But the larger part, the part that had built an international empire while they assumed I was barely competent to manage a household budget, knew better. I'm somewhere you can't follow, Patricia, living the life I've earned through 15 years of careful planning and strategic thinking. The life you assumed I was too old and too confused to build for myself. This is about money, Patricia said suddenly, her tone shifting from pleading to accusatory. You're punishing us financially because we hurt your feelings. No, Patricia. This is about respect, autonomy, and the fundamental right of every human being to be treated with dignity regardless of their age. The money is simply the tool that makes my independence possible. You can't just abandon your family. I didn't abandon my family, Patricia. My family abandoned me first. You just didn't realize I had options. After ending the call with Patricia, I sat in contemplation for several hours. The conversation had been both cathartic and heartbreaking, confirming everything I had suspected about my children's motivations while simultaneously destroying any remaining hope that our relationship could be salvaged. Over the next several days, I received increasingly desperate calls from all 3 of my children. Robert tried to appeal to my business sense, arguing that my disappearance was causing him professional embarrassment among his colleagues who knew about his declining elderly mother. Thomas alternated between anger and pleading, at one point threatening to hire private investigators to track me down, then breaking down in tears as he confessed that his gambling debts had put him in physical danger. It was Thomas's situation that gave me the most pause. Despite his betrayal, he was still my baby, the child I had rocked to sleep and comforted through nightmares. But I also remembered the cold calculation in his voice as he planned to institutionalize me for his own financial benefit. Mrs. Chen, who had become my informal counselor as well as my assistant, found me on the terrace one evening as I wrestled with these conflicting emotions. "You're thinking about helping him," she said, settling into the chair beside me with her own cup of coffee. "He's in trouble, Elena," I said, using the name she had asked me to call her years ago when formal titles began to feel too distant. "Whatever else he's done, he's still my son. He's also a grown man who made the conscious choice to gamble away his family's security and then decided that the solution was to betray his mother's trust." Elena had a way of cutting through emotional fog with surgical precision, a skill that had made her invaluable in business negotiations over the years. "I know," I sighed, "but I also know that his addiction is a disease, not a moral failing." "His addiction may be a disease, Eleanor, but his decision to solve his problems by institutionalizing you against your will was a moral choice, and not a very admirable one." She was right, of course. Thomas's gambling addiction was something that deserved compassion and treatment, but his willingness to sacrifice my freedom for his financial convenience was something else entirely. "What would you do?" I asked her. Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the Gulf in a spectacular display of orange and purple. "I would remember that enablement and love are not the same thing. I would remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the consequences of their choices." That night, I made a decision that would define the rest of my relationship with my children. I instructed Marcus to establish a medical fund that would cover any treatment Thomas needed for his gambling addiction, but nothing more. If he wanted to get clean and rebuild his life, I would ensure he had access to the best possible care. If he wanted to continue gambling and expecting others to cover his losses, he would have to look elsewhere for enablement. For Robert and Patricia, I established educational trust funds that would provide full scholarships for any of their children who wanted to pursue degrees in social work, elder care, or nonprofit management. The message was clear. If the next generation wanted to benefit from the Whitmore family wealth, they would have to demonstrate a commitment to helping others rather than exploiting them. The irony was not lost on me that my children would have inherited everything if they had simply continued to treat me with basic human dignity. Their greed and impatience had cost them one of the largest fortunes they would ever encounter. As the weeks passed, the desperate phone calls became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. I received word through Marcus that Robert had been forced to take a second mortgage on his house to cover some bad investments. Patricia had lost several high-profile clients due to the distraction of our family crisis, and Thomas had been admitted to a rehabilitation facility using the medical fund I had established. Part of me felt vindicated by their struggles, but a larger part simply felt sad. I had raised these children to be better than what they had become, and their failure to live up to their potential was as much my failure as theirs. My new life in Dubai, however, was exceeding every expectation I had harbored during those years of secret planning. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation was taking shape as a comprehensive support system for elderly individuals who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families. We provided legal assistance, financial counseling, housing support, and most importantly, a community where people could rebuild their lives with dignity. The Foundation's first major initiative was the construction of a luxury residential community designed specifically for active seniors who wanted independence without isolation. Unlike the sterile institutional facilities my children had planned to warehouse me in, our community was designed around the principle that aging should be about adding life to years, not just years to life. Every resident had their own private apartment with a full kitchen, access to communal spaces that included everything from art studios to business centers, and most importantly, complete autonomy over their own decisions. No one could be admitted without their explicit consent, and no one could be removed against their will as long as they weren't posing a danger to themselves or others. The project attracted international attention from urban planners, geriatricians, and human rights advocates who saw it as a revolutionary approach to senior living. More importantly, it attracted residents who had been written off by their families, but who still had decades of productive, meaningful life ahead of them. Margaret Chen was one of our first residents, a 72-year-old former engineering professor whose children had tried to have her declared incompetent so they could sell her house and force her into a nursing home. Elena had discovered Margaret's case through our legal assistance program and immediately recognized a kindred spirit. They told the judge I was developing dementia because I forgot to pay a utility bill one month, Margaret told me during our first meeting. One bill, Eleanor. In 60 years of managing my own finances, I missed one payment because I was grieving the loss of my cat, and suddenly I'm incompetent to make my own decisions. Margaret's story was remarkably similar to my own, though she lacked the financial resources that had made my escape possible. Through the foundation, we were able to provide her with legal representation that successfully challenged her children's competency petition, and she moved into our residential community with her dignity and independence intact. The ironic thing, Margaret continued, settling into the comfortable chair in my office with a cup of tea, is that I probably would have left them most of my estate if they had just continued treating me like a human being instead of a burden to be managed. This sentiment was echoed by dozens of other residents who had similar stories of family betrayal. It seemed that my experience with Robert, Patricia, and Thomas was not unique, but rather part of a disturbing pattern of elder abuse that was largely hidden from public view. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the geriatrician we hired to oversee the medical aspects of our community, explained the psychology behind this phenomenon during one of our staff meetings. Adult children who engage in this kind of behavior often justify it by telling themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest, she said. They convince themselves that their parents are no longer capable of making rational decisions, which absolves them of guilt about overriding those decisions for financial gain. But surely they must know on some level that they're being manipulative, Elena interjected. Of course they do, Dr. Mitchell replied. But people are remarkably good at self-deception when it serves their financial interests. They tell themselves that their parents would thank them if they understood the situation properly, or that they're protecting their parents from making mistakes that could cost them everything. I thought about Patricia's words during our phone conversation, about how they thought they were protecting me from being taken advantage of. The fact that they had been the ones taking advantage of me seemed to be a blind spot they couldn't acknowledge. The tragedy, Dr. Mitchell continued, is that in most cases, these families could have achieved their financial goals through honest communication and collaborative planning, but that would require treating their elderly relatives as equals in the decision-making process, which many adult children find threatening or inconvenient. 6 months after my arrival in Dubai, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson, my former neighbor who was now the legal owner of my old house, had flown halfway around the world to see me. "Eleanor, dear," she said, as Ahmed escorted her onto the terrace where I was having my morning coffee. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I felt I needed to speak with you in person." I was delighted to see her, of course, and immediately instructed the staff to prepare the guest suite for an extended stay. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the few genuine relationships I had maintained during my years of playing the role of the modest elderly widow, and her presence felt like a bridge between my old life and my new one. "How are you managing with the house?" I asked, after we had settled in with fresh coffee and some of the chef's excellent pastries. "Oh, the house is wonderful, Eleanor, and I can't thank you enough for your generosity, but that's not really why I'm here." She paused, clearly struggling with how to begin whatever she had come to tell me. "It's about your children," she said finally. "Eleanor, I think you should know what's been happening since you left." Over the next hour, Mrs. Henderson painted a picture of my children's lives that was both predictable and deeply troubling. Robert had become increasingly erratic at work, making poor investment decisions that had cost his firm significant money and damaged his reputation among colleagues. His marriage was strained to the breaking point, with his wife threatening divorce if he didn't resolve the family situation that was affecting every aspect of their lives. Patricia had thrown herself into trying to locate me with an obsessive intensity that was alienating her law partners and clients. She had hired 3 different private investigation firms, contacted international law enforcement agencies, and even attempted to freeze my assets through court orders that were dismissed when it became clear she had no legal standing to challenge my financial decisions. Thomas had completed his rehabilitation program, but was struggling with the reality of rebuilding his life without the financial cushion he had expected to inherit. He was living in a halfway house and working as a night security guard, a dramatic fall from the lifestyle he had maintained through years of borrowing against his anticipated inheritance. "But here's the thing, Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson said, leaning forward with an intensity I had rarely seen from her. "I don't think any of them have learned anything from this experience. They're not reflecting on their behavior or questioning their assumptions about your capabilities. They're just angry and frustrated that their plans didn't work out." This was perhaps the most disappointing news I could have received. I had hoped that the dramatic consequences of their betrayal might serve as a wake-up call, forcing them to examine their relationship with money and family loyalty. Instead, it seemed they were treating my disappearance as an inconvenient obstacle to their financial goals rather than a natural consequence of their moral failures. "Robert came by the house last month," Mrs. Henderson continued. "He was demanding access to your belongings, claiming that as your eldest son, he had a right to family heirlooms and personal items. When I reminded him that the house and everything in it now belonged to me, he became quite hostile." "Hostile how?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He accused me of manipulating you, of taking advantage of a confused elderly woman for personal gain. He said that when you came to your senses and returned home, he would make sure I was prosecuted for elder abuse." The irony was breathtaking. Robert, who had planned to institutionalize me against my will so he could liquidate my assets, was accusing Mrs. Henderson of elder abuse for accepting the gift I had freely given her. "Patricia was even worse," Mrs. Henderson continued. "She served me with legal papers claiming I had no right to the property because you lacked the mental capacity to make such a significant financial decision. She actually argued in court that your disappearance proved you were incompetent to manage your own affairs. This legal argument was particularly galling because it perfectly encapsulated the circular logic my children were using to justify their behavior. They had planned to institutionalize me because they claimed I was incompetent, and when I demonstrated my competence by outmaneuvering them completely, they used my success as evidence of incompetence." "And Thomas?" I asked. "Thomas showed up drunk at my door 3 weeks ago, crying and begging me to tell him where you were. He said his creditors were threatening to hurt him if he didn't pay his debts, and that you were the only person who could save him. When I told him I couldn't help, he accused me of being part of some conspiracy to steal his inheritance." Mrs. Henderson's visit forced me to confront a reality I had been avoiding. My children were not learning from their mistakes because they refused to acknowledge that they had made any mistakes. In their minds, they were the victims of an elaborate deception perpetrated by their manipulative mother and her co-conspirators. This realization crystallized my understanding of why so many family relationships deteriorate around issues of aging and inheritance. It wasn't just about money, though money certainly played a role. It was about fundamental questions of respect, autonomy, and the right of elderly individuals to be treated as full human beings rather than problems to be managed. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson said hesitantly. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I think you have a right to know." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, handling it like it contained something distasteful. "Patricia gave an interview to the local newspaper about elder abuse and missing persons. She's been portraying you as a vulnerable victim who was manipulated into leaving your family." I unfolded the clipping and read the headline, "Local Attorney Warns About Elder Exploitation After Mother's Mysterious Disappearance." The article painted me as a confused elderly woman who had been taken advantage of by unscrupulous individuals who had convinced me to liquidate my assets and flee the country. According to sources close to the family, the article read, Eleanor Whitmore had been showing signs of cognitive decline for months before her disappearance. Her daughter, Patricia Whitmore Stevens, a prominent local attorney, believes her mother may have been the victim of a sophisticated financial scam targeting elderly individuals. The article went on to quote Patricia extensively about the dangers facing elderly people who lived alone, the importance of family oversight in financial matters, and the need for stronger legal protections against elder abuse. It was a masterful piece of public relations that positioned my children as concerned family members trying to protect their vulnerable mother from exploitation. "She's giving talks at senior centers now," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, warning other elderly people about the dangers of financial scams and urging them to involve their adult children in major financial decisions. The bitter irony of Patricia using my situation to build her professional reputation while simultaneously hunting for me like a bounty hunter was almost too much to bear. She was literally profiting from the narrative that I was an incompetent victim, while simultaneously trying to prove that narrative in court. "Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "I came here because I was worried about you. I know why you left, and I don't blame you for it, but I wanted to make sure you understood what you're dealing with. Your children aren't going to give up easily, and they're not going to accept responsibility for driving you away." I thanked Mrs. Henderson for her honesty and her loyalty, though her news was deeply troubling. Over the following days, I consulted with international legal experts about the possibility that my children might try to have me declared missing or incompetent in absentia, potentially freezing my assets or forcing my extradition. The consensus among the lawyers was that my children had very little legal standing as long as I remained mentally competent and wasn't being held against my will. However, they warned that prolonged legal harassment could be both expensive and emotionally draining, regardless of its ultimate lack of merit. This prompted me to make a decision I had been avoiding. It was time to make my situation public on my own terms, rather than allowing my children to control the narrative through their victim portrayal in the media. Working with Elena and a team of public relations professionals, I prepared for what would become one of the most widely covered stories about elder rights and family betrayal in recent memory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would give a single, comprehensive interview to an international news organization, telling my story in my own words and demonstrating beyond any doubt that I was mentally competent and acting of my own free will. The journalist we selected was Amanda Reynolds, an investigative reporter for the International Herald Tribune who specialized in human rights issues and had written extensively about elder abuse in various cultural contexts. Amanda flew to Dubai for a 3-day interview process that would include not only my personal story, but also tours of the Foundation's facilities and interviews with other residents who had experienced similar family betrayals. "Mrs. Whitmore," Amanda said, as we began our first formal interview session, "you're aware that your children have been portraying you as a victim of financial exploitation and possible kidnapping. How do you respond to those characterizations?" "I respond by pointing out the obvious," I said, gesturing around the luxurious mansion where we were sitting. "Does this look like the situation of someone who has been exploited or kidnapped? I am living in a home I own, surrounded by staff I employ, running a foundation I created in a country I chose to move to. The only exploitation I experienced was at the hands of my own children, who planned to institutionalize me against my will so they could steal my assets." Amanda's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitmore. Can you prove that your children were planning to institutionalize you?" "I can prove it because I heard them planning it with my own ears," I replied, and then recounted in detail the conversation I had overheard on that fateful Sunday evening. The interview continued for hours, covering every aspect of my story from Charles's death through my secret wealth accumulation to my dramatic escape and the establishment of the foundation. Amanda was thorough and skeptical, asking pointed questions about my mental state, my financial decisions, and my motivations for cutting contact with my children. "Some people might argue that you're being vindictive," Amanda said during one particularly intense exchange, "that you're punishing your children financially because they hurt your feelings rather than because they posed any real threat to your well-being." "Amanda," I replied, "let me ask you something. If your adult children were secretly planning to have you declared incompetent so they could institutionalize you and liquidate your assets, would you consider that a threat to your well-being or just hurt feelings?" "That would definitely be a threat," she admitted. "Then you understand my situation perfectly. This was never about hurt feelings. This was about 3 adult children who decided that their financial convenience was more important than their mother's fundamental human rights." The most powerful part of the interview came when Amanda asked me to respond directly to Patricia's public statements about elder abuse and the need for family oversight in financial matters. Patricia has built her recent legal practice around warning elderly people about financial exploitation, I said, while simultaneously trying to exploit her own mother financially. She's giving talks about the importance of treating elderly people with dignity while attempting to have me declared incompetent for refusing to submit to institutionalization. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain both positions simultaneously is truly remarkable. Amanda also interviewed Elena, Mrs. Henderson, Marcus, and several residents of our elder community, building a comprehensive picture that made it impossible to dismiss my story as the delusions of a confused elderly woman. The documentation of my financial competence, my detailed planning process, and my successful creation of an international charitable foundation painted a picture of someone whose mental faculties were not only intact, but exceptionally sharp. The article was published 3 months after Mrs. Henderson's visit, appearing simultaneously in print and online editions of the International Herald Tribune with the headline, "The Heiress Who Faked Her Own Helplessness, An Elderly Woman's Escape from Family Betrayal." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, the story had been picked up by major news outlets around the world, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from readers who shared similar experiences of family betrayal or elder abuse. More importantly, the article sparked a broader conversation about elder rights, family dynamics around inheritance, and the assumptions society makes about elderly people's capabilities. Legal experts weighed in on the inadequacies of current elder protection laws. Geriatricians discussed the harmful effects of ageism in medical settings, and social workers shared stories of elderly clients who had been victimized by their own families. The public reaction to my children's behavior was swift and harsh. Patricia's law practice was inundated with negative reviews and cancellations from clients who found her hypocrisy regarding elder abuse unpalatable. Robert's investment firm quietly asked him to take a leave of absence after several major clients expressed concerns about his judgment and ethics. Thomas, still struggling with his recovery, was largely spared public scrutiny, but found himself unemployable in any position requiring financial responsibility or trustworthiness. I felt no satisfaction in their professional and social destruction, only a deep sadness that it had come to this point. They had been given every opportunity to treat me with basic human dignity, and their refusal to do so had cost them everything they thought they wanted. The most gratifying response to the article came from elderly individuals around the world who reached out to share their own stories of family betrayal and to thank me for speaking out about a problem that was far more widespread than most people realized. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation received thousands of inquiries from elderly people seeking legal assistance, housing support, or simply a community where they could live with dignity. We expanded our residential community to accommodate the demand, eventually developing similar facilities in 3 other countries. Each location was designed around the same core principles: respect for individual autonomy, rejection of ageist assumptions about competence, and the understanding that elderly people deserve to live full, meaningful lives rather than simply existing in institutional warehouses. Dr. Mitchell, our geriatrician, published several research papers based on our community model, demonstrating significant improvements in both physical and mental health outcomes when elderly individuals were treated as autonomous agents rather than problems to be managed. Her work contributed to policy changes in several countries regarding elder care standards and family involvement in medical decision-making. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the letters I received from adult children who had read my story and recognized uncomfortable parallels in their own relationships with their elderly parents. Many of them reached out to apologize for assumptions they had made or boundaries they had crossed, using my experience as a wake-up call to examine their own behavior. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman named Jennifer, whose mother had been living in a nursing home against her will for 2 years. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jennifer wrote, "after reading your story, I realized that I had been treating my mother exactly the way your children treated you. I convinced myself that I was protecting her by overriding her desire to live independently, when really I was just protecting myself from the anxiety of worrying about her safety. Your article made me understand that my peace of mind was not worth my mother's autonomy." Jennifer had worked with her mother to transition her out of the nursing home and into a supportive, independent living situation that respected her desire for autonomy while providing appropriate safety measures. It was exactly the kind of collaborative solution that could have been possible with my own children if they had been willing to see me as a partner rather than a problem. 5 years after my escape to Dubai, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Marcus's office. The return address showed that it came from Thomas, though the handwriting was so shaky I barely recognized it. "Dear Mom," the letter began. "I know I have no right to contact you after everything that happened, but I wanted you to know that I've been sober for 3 years now, and I finally understand what we did to you." The letter went on for several pages, detailing Thomas's journey through recovery and his growing awareness of how his addiction had distorted his values and relationships. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply wanted to acknowledge the harm he had caused and to express genuine remorse for his role in the betrayal. "I used to tell myself that we were helping you," he wrote, "but I know now that we were just helping ourselves to your money while convincing ourselves we were being responsible. I understand why you left, and I understand why you can't trust us anymore. I just wanted you to know that at least one of your children finally gets it." The letter ended with a simple statement that brought tears to my eyes. "I'm proud of what you built in Dubai, Mom. I'm proud that you were strong enough to save yourself when we failed you. I hope someday I can be half as brave as you were." I showed the letter to Elena, who read it carefully before offering her characteristic direct assessment. "It sounds genuine," she said. "But words are easy, Eleanor. The question is whether he's actually changed or whether he's just learned to say what he thinks you want to hear." She was right to be skeptical, of course. Thomas had been manipulative for years, and his addiction had made him particularly skilled at saying whatever was necessary to get what he wanted. But something in the tone of his letter felt different, more honest and self-aware than anything I had heard from any of my children since this ordeal began. After much deliberation, I decided to respond to Thomas's letter, though I was careful to set clear boundaries about what kind of relationship might be possible going forward. "Dear Thomas," I wrote, "I appreciate your letter and your acknowledgement of the harm that was caused. However, I want you to understand that acknowledgement of past mistakes is just the first step in rebuilding trust, not the final one." I explained that if he was genuinely committed to making amends, he could demonstrate that commitment by volunteering with organizations that served elderly populations, contributing his time and skills to help people who had been in situations similar to mine. "Actions speak louder than words," I continued, "and the only way I can evaluate the sincerity of your remorse is by observing how you treat other elderly people, now that you claim to understand the harm you caused me." I also made it clear that any future relationship would require him to respect my autonomy completely, including my decision to live in Dubai and my refusal to provide financial support for anything beyond medical treatment for his addiction. "I am willing to consider rebuilding some form of relationship with you," I concluded, "but it will be on my terms, at my pace, and with full respect for the boundaries I have established. If you can accept those conditions, we might be able to find a way forward. If not, then this letter will be my final communication with you." Thomas's response came 6 months later, along with documentation showing that he had been volunteering 20 hours per week at a local senior center, helping elderly residents with computer skills and transportation needs. He had also completed additional addiction counseling and was working as a substance abuse counselor himself, specializing in gambling addiction. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation," he wrote in his second letter. "I'm just trying to prove to myself that I can be the kind of person you deserved as a son. If someday you decide you want to talk, I'll be here. If not, I understand." Over the following year, Thomas sent quarterly updates about his volunteer work and his recovery, never asking for anything in return but simply keeping me informed about his efforts to make amends through service to others. The reports showed a consistency and commitment that was completely different from the impulsive, self-serving behavior that had characterized his addiction years. Eventually, I began to believe that his transformation might be genuine, not because of his words, but because of his sustained actions over time and his apparent acceptance that rebuilding our relationship was entirely my choice to make. I decided to test this belief by inviting him to visit Dubai for a week, with the understanding that the visit was conditional on his continued respect for my boundaries and his acceptance that I was under no obligation to resume a parental role in his life. Thomas's visit was both awkward and surprisingly healing. He spent most of his time touring the Foundation's facilities and learning about our programs, asking thoughtful questions about elder care, and expressing genuine admiration for what we had built. He didn't ask for money, didn't pressure me for emotional reconciliation, and didn't try to guilt me about the consequences his siblings were still experiencing. "I'm not the same person who planned to put you in an institution," he said during one of our conversations. "I don't even understand how I became that person, but I know I never want to be him again." By the end of the week, I felt cautiously optimistic that Thomas had genuinely changed and that some form of limited relationship might be possible. Not the close mother-son bond we had once shared, which had been irreparably damaged by his betrayal, but perhaps a respectful adult friendship based on mutual understanding and clearly defined boundaries. Robert and Patricia, meanwhile, had shown no signs of self-reflection or genuine remorse. Patricia continued to practice elder law, while apparently learning nothing from her own attempt to abuse an elderly family member. Robert had eventually found new employment at a smaller investment firm, but continued to blame his professional setbacks on my selfish and vindictive behavior rather than examining his own ethical failures. Both of them had attempted to contact me through various intermediaries over the years, but their messages consistently focused on their own suffering and their desire for me to come home and work things out, rather than acknowledging the fundamental wrongs they had committed, or demonstrating any understanding of why their behavior had been so harmful. "They still don't get it," Elena observed after reviewing their latest attempts at communication. "They're treating this like a family feud that can be resolved through negotiation rather than a fundamental breach of trust that requires genuine accountability." I had come to the same conclusion. While Thomas had done the hard work of examining his behavior and making amends through service to others, Robert and Patricia remained focused on managing the consequences of their actions, rather than understanding why those actions had been wrong in the first place. This difference in approach confirmed my belief that people's responses to being held accountable for their behavior reveal their true character more clearly than their original mistakes. Thomas had used his consequences as motivation for genuine self-improvement, while Robert and Patricia had used their consequences as evidence that they were victims of unfair treatment. As I entered my 6th year in Dubai, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal that had initially seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me had actually become the catalyst for the most meaningful and fulfilling period of my life. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had grown into an international organization serving thousands of elderly individuals who had been abandoned, abused, or neglected by their families. Our residential communities had become models for respectful elder care, and our legal advocacy program had helped change laws in multiple countries to better protect elderly individuals from family-based financial abuse. More importantly, I had discovered that my capabilities and potential for impact had not diminished with age, but had actually expanded as I gained the freedom to use my resources and experience in ways that aligned with my values rather than my children's expectations. The wealth that my children had been so eager to inherit was being put to far better use than they ever could have imagined. Instead of being divided among 3 people who already had comfortable lives, it was being used to provide dignity, security, and purpose to thousands of elderly individuals who had been written off by society and their own families. I often wondered what would have happened if my children had simply continued treating me with basic respect and consideration. They would have inherited everything eventually, and I would have been happy to share my wealth with them during my lifetime for meaningful purposes. Their impatience and greed had cost them not just money, but the opportunity to be part of something larger and more meaningful than their individual financial goals. Mrs. Henderson, who had become a frequent visitor to Dubai and a close friend in her own right, summed it up perfectly during one of her stays. "Eleanor," she said, as we watched the sunset from the terrace, "your children spent so much time planning how to take your money that they never bothered to learn what kind of person you really were. They thought they were outsmarting a confused old lady, when really they were challenging someone who had been building international empires while they were still learning basic arithmetic." She was right, of course. My children had made the classic mistake of underestimating someone based on their age and their assumptions about elderly people's capabilities. They had seen what they expected to see and had planned accordingly, never realizing that their target was not only aware of their plans, but was several steps ahead of them in every way that mattered. The story of my escape from family betrayal had become something larger than my personal situation. It had become a symbol of elderly people's right to autonomy, dignity, and respect, regardless of their children's financial expectations or assumptions about age-related decline. Speaking engagements, media interviews, and foundation events kept me busier in my 70s and 80s than I had been in decades. Rather than spending my final years as a passive recipient of care in an institutional setting, I was actively shaping policy discussions, mentoring other elderly entrepreneurs, and building something that would outlast my own lifetime. The irony was not lost on me that my children's attempt to warehouse me had instead launched me into the most productive and impactful phase of my entire life. Their betrayal had freed me from the constraints of their expectations and their assumption that my useful life was essentially over. Dr. Mitchell often used my story in her research presentations about successful aging, pointing out that the arbitrary restrictions placed on elderly individuals by their families often had more to do with the family's anxieties and prejudices than with any actual limitations imposed by age. Eleanor Whitmore is living proof, she would tell her audiences, that the biggest barriers to successful aging are often social and familial, rather than physical or cognitive. When we remove those barriers and treat elderly individuals as capable adults, we often discover that their potential for growth and contribution is far greater than anyone imagined. As I approached my 80th birthday, I began to think seriously about succession planning for the foundation and my various business interests. Unlike my children, who had planned to inherit without earning anything, I was determined to ensure that my legacy would continue through people who had demonstrated genuine commitment to the values and mission I had spent these years building. Elena had emerged as the natural choice to lead the foundation after my death or incapacitation. She understood not only the operational aspects of our work, but also the philosophical principles that drove our mission. More importantly, she had proven over years of collaboration that she could be trusted with both significant responsibility and significant resources. Thomas had asked to be considered for a role in the foundation's succession planning, and after careful consideration, I decided to include him in a limited capacity. His experience with addiction recovery and his volunteer work with elderly populations had given him valuable insights that could benefit our programs, and his genuine transformation had earned him a second chance, though not a complete restoration of trust. Robert and Patricia were not included in any succession planning, a decision that undoubtedly would have devastating consequences for their financial expectations, but seemed entirely appropriate given their continued refusal to acknowledge their wrongdoing or demonstrate genuine change. The legal documents I prepared included detailed explanations of these decisions, making it clear that the exclusion of Robert and Patricia was not arbitrary or vindictive, but was based on their demonstrated inability to treat elderly individuals, including their own mother, with basic dignity and respect. People who are willing to institutionalize their own mother for financial gain, I wrote in the explanatory letter that would be released with my will, cannot be trusted with resources intended to protect elderly individuals from exactly that kind of abuse. My 80th birthday celebration was held at the Dubai Mansion, with guests including foundation staff, community residents, international colleagues, and the few family members who had earned the right to be included. Thomas was there, along with Mrs. Henderson and her daughter, who had become an important part of my chosen family over the years. The celebration was everything my children's obligatory family dinners had never been: genuine, joyful, and filled with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I might leave them. It was a powerful reminder that family is not just about blood relations, but about the relationships we choose to nurture and maintain based on mutual respect and genuine care. During the evening's speeches, Elena presented me with a gift that brought tears to my eyes: a leather-bound book containing letters from hundreds of elderly individuals whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's programs. The letters told stories of renewed independence, restored dignity, and hope found in situations that had seemed hopeless. Mrs. Whitmore read one letter from a 90-year-old woman in Australia. "Your foundation helped me escape from my son's house, where I was being treated like a burden and a source of free childcare. Because of your legal assistance program, I now live in my own apartment again and have reconnected with friends I thought I had lost forever. You saved my life, and I will never forget it." Another letter came from an 85-year-old man whose children had been systematically stealing from his bank accounts. The financial counselors at your foundation not only helped me recover most of my stolen money, but also taught me how to protect myself from future exploitation. More importantly, they helped me understand that my children's behavior was not normal or acceptable, and that I deserved better treatment. Reading these letters reminded me that the pain of my children's betrayal had been transformed into something meaningful and redemptive. Their attempt to destroy my autonomy had instead motivated me to protect and restore the autonomy of thousands of other elderly individuals who had faced similar threats. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Thomas approached me with a small, wrapped package. "I know this doesn't make up for anything," he said, "but I wanted you to have something that represents who you really are, not who we tried to make you be." Inside the package was a small bronze sculpture of a phoenix rising from flames, with an inscription that read, "To Eleanor Whitmore, who turned betrayal into triumph and showed the world what resilience looks like." It was a thoughtful gift that demonstrated his understanding of what I had accomplished and why it mattered. More importantly, it showed that he had moved beyond focusing on his own guilt and shame to genuinely appreciating the positive impact that had emerged from our family's crisis. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "This means more to me than you know." "I know I can never undo what we did to you," he replied, "but I hope I can spend the rest of my life proving that I learned from it." Our relationship would never be what it once was, but it had evolved into something different and perhaps more honest than the traditional parent-child dynamic that had been built on his expectation of inheritance and my assumption of unconditional maternal love. As I settled into bed that night, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a legacy thoughtfully constructed, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. My children's betrayal had initially felt like the end of my story, but it had actually been the beginning of the most important chapter of my life. The quiet satisfaction I felt was not about revenge or vindication, though both had certainly played their roles in my initial motivation. It was about the knowledge that I had used my remaining years to build something meaningful, something that would continue to protect and empower elderly individuals long after I was gone. My children had seen my age as a sign of weakness and incompetence, but it had actually been a source of wisdom, experience, and resources that they could never have imagined. Their failure to recognize my true capabilities had been their downfall, but it had also been my liberation. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation would be my real legacy, not the biological children who had planned to dispose of me, but the thousands of elderly individuals who would continue to benefit from the resources and programs I had created. They were my true heirs, the ones who understood the value of dignity, respect, and autonomy in aging. In the end, my children's greed had cost them everything they thought they wanted, while giving me everything I actually needed: the freedom to live and die on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. As I drifted off to sleep in my luxurious bedroom overlooking the Persian Gulf, I smiled at the thought of my children's reaction when they eventually learned the full extent of what their impatience had cost them. The modest inheritance they had been so eager to claim would have paled in comparison to the fortune they had ultimately forfeited through their betrayal. But more than the money, they had lost the opportunity to be part of something larger than themselves, something that would outlast their individual lifetimes and make a real difference in the world. That was the true tragedy of their story and the true triumph of mine. The woman they had tried to silence and institutionalize had instead become a voice for thousands of elderly individuals who had been similarly dismissed and devalued. The assets they had planned to liquidate had instead been transformed into a permanent foundation for protecting elderly rights and dignity. Their attempt to end my story had instead given it its most powerful and meaningful chapter, proving that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can become the catalysts for the most extraordinary transformations. And as I finally fell asleep in my mansion in Dubai, surrounded by luxury they could never have imagined and security they could never threaten, I knew that I had won not just the battle they had started, but the war they never realized they were fighting, the war for my right to live and die as the powerful, capable, and dignified woman I had always been, regardless of their assumptions about what elderly mothers were supposed to be.